When a country loses access to the dollar clearing system, it doesn't announce the decision with press releases or formal declarations. The infrastructure simply stops working. Wire transfers fail. Letters of credit expire. Trade halts. Not because of bombs or sanctions packages debated in parliaments, but because lines of code, maintained by private institutions in New York and London, stop recognizing certain transaction patterns as legitimate. This is how modern power operates. Quietly. Through systems most people don't see. In 2012, Iranian banks were disconnected from SWIFT, the Belgian messaging system that coordinates international payments. Iran didn't lose a war. It didn't surrender territory. It simply lost the ability to move money across borders through conventional channels. Oil exports, the backbone of Iran's economy, became logistically complex. Buyers had to arrange payment through intermediaries, accept discounts, navigate opacity. The damage wasn't immediate. It compounded over months and years. Iran's currency fell. Inflation accelerated. Living standards declined. Not from military invasion, but from exclusion from financial infrastructure. This is the quiet architecture of control, and it's built on an assumption that's beginning to fracture. The assumption is this, that the institutions controlling global financial infrastructure will remain neutral arbiters, that SWIFT will clear transactions without political consideration, that the Federal Reserve's dollar swap lines will be available to any central bank managing liquidity, that correspondent banking relationships will function based on commercial logic rather than geopolitical alignment. For decades, this assumption held. The system was treated as utility infrastructure, like international shipping lanes or telecommunications cables. Political disputes happened in other domains, military, diplomatic, trade, but the financial architecture remained separate. That separation is ending, and the consequences are not what the system's architects anticipated. Welcome to Silent Economy. What we're witnessing is the weaponization of infrastructure that was designed to be neutral. And like most weaponization, it creates pressures that ultimately undermine the weapon itself. This isn't speculation. It's pattern recognition. The same dynamics have played out before, in different contexts, with different tools. The British Empire controlled global telecommunications through undersea cable networks. By 1914, Britain owned or controlled 60% of the world's cable infrastructure. During World War I, Britain cut Germany's cables, isolating German communications. Operationally, it worked. Strategically, it accelerated Germany's investment in radio technology and motivated other nations to build redundant systems. Within 2 decades, the cable monopoly Britain had used as a weapon was obsolete. Not because cables stopped working, but because dependence on British-controlled infrastructure became unacceptable to enough actors that alternative systems emerged. The dollar clearing system is undergoing a similar process. Not because the dollar is failing as a currency, but because dependence on dollar-denominated infrastructure has become a strategic vulnerability that nations are actively trying to mitigate. Consider the progression. In 2014, Russia was partially excluded from Western financial systems following Crimea. The immediate effect was painful. Russian banks struggled. The ruble fell. But the exclusion also created incentive. Russia built the SPFS system, its own alternative to SWIFT. It encouraged adoption of the Chinese yuan for bilateral trade. It accumulated gold reserves at accelerated rates, shifting away from dollar-denominated assets. By 2022, when more comprehensive sanctions were implemented, Russia had infrastructure to absorb the shock. The damage was real, but Russia didn't collapse because it had spent 8 years preparing for exactly this scenario. This is the core dynamic. When infrastructure is weaponized, it stops being trusted as infrastructure. And when trust erodes, parallel systems emerge. China understood this early. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't primarily about building roads and ports. It's about creating alternative channels for trade and finance that don't route through Western-controlled infrastructure. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, China's answer to SWIFT, processes transactions without touching American financial institutions. The system is smaller and less efficient than SWIFT. That's not the point. The point is creating optionality, the ability to function if access to Western infrastructure is withdrawn. This is where the unintended consequences begin. Every time financial infrastructure is used as a weapon, it demonstrates to observers that the infrastructure is not neutral, that access is conditional, that reliance is vulnerability. The result is predictable: diversification. Not away from the dollar immediately, but away from exclusive dependence on dollar systems. Central banks hold more non-dollar reserves. Trade agreements incorporate non-dollar settlement options. Even allies begin building redundancy. Saudi Arabia, historically the anchor of the petrodollar system, now discusses yuan-denominated oil sales. Not because the yuan is superior, but because diversification reduces vulnerability to any single system's weaponization. The architects of financial sanctions believe they're deploying a cost-free tool. After all, the dollar doesn't disappear from global reserve holdings overnight. SWIFT doesn't become irrelevant immediately. The infrastructure maintains its dominance for years, perhaps decades. But dominance is not the same as entrenchment. Dominance can erode slowly, then suddenly. The process is not visible in quarterly statistics. It's visible in decisions that accumulate. A central bank buying slightly less treasury debt, a trade agreement including currency swap provisions, a payment system routing through Shanghai instead of New York. Each decision is small. Collectively, they represent structural shift. This is not advocacy for or against any particular system. It's observation of mechanical process. When a tool is weaponized, responses emerge. Those responses change the landscape in ways that ultimately limit the weapon's effectiveness. The British cable monopoly taught us this. The U.S. oil embargo against Japan in 1941 taught us this. Sanctions rarely produce the intended strategic outcome without creating unintended strategic costs. The weaponization of finance is following the same pattern, and the pattern has an endpoint. The endpoint is fragmentation, not immediate collapse, but gradual separation into parallel systems. A dollar-denominated sphere operating through Western infrastructure, a yuan-denominated sphere operating through Chinese infrastructure, hybrid arrangements, regional systems, bilateral agreements. This is inefficient. Fragmented systems have higher transaction costs, more friction, less liquidity. Globalization promised efficiency through integration. What we're witnessing is the reversal of that integration. But inefficiency is acceptable when the alternative is vulnerability. A nation that can be cut off from the global financial system overnight will accept higher costs to maintain autonomy. This isn't irrational. It's strategic calculation. The historical parallel is the Cold War. After 1945, the world economy fragmented into Western and Soviet blocs. Trade between blocs was minimal. Each system developed its own institutions, its own infrastructure. This was inefficient, but it was stable because each bloc controlled its own critical systems. The post-Cold War era promised the end of this fragmentation. One integrated global economy, one set of institutions, maximum efficiency. That promise is unwinding. Not because efficiency doesn't matter, but because when efficiency becomes weaponizable, it transforms into strategic liability. Here's what makes this particularly complex. The dollar's dominance isn't only about American power. It's also about network effects and incumbent advantage. The dollar is used globally because it's used globally. SWIFT dominates because it already dominates. Changing infrastructure has massive switching costs. This creates inertia. Even as nations build alternatives, The dollar system remains easier, more liquid, more established. This inertia is real and substantial. But inertia is not permanence. Inertia slows change. It doesn't prevent it. And once a threshold is crossed, once enough parallel infrastructure exists, the switching costs decline. Think about how telecommunications shifted. For decades, landlines dominated because the network was already built. The infrastructure existed. Switching to mobile was expensive and inefficient in the early stages. But once mobile infrastructure reached critical density, the switch accelerated. Not because landlines stopped working, but because mobile offered optionality that landlines couldn't match. The incumbent advantage evaporated within a decade. Financial infrastructure can follow similar trajectory. The dollar system remains dominant today, but if alternative systems reach sufficient density, if enough trade can route through non-dollar channels, the incumbent advantage diminishes. We're watching the early stages of that process now. The question isn't whether this creates vulnerability for the United States. It clearly does. The ability to use financial infrastructure as a weapon is only valuable as long as that infrastructure remains indispensable. Once alternatives exist, the weapon's credibility declines. The question is whether this process is reversible. And the answer appears to be no. Not because reversal is technically impossible, but because trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. A nation that has been excluded from financial infrastructure once will always maintain redundancy. Even if relations normalize, the memory remains. The alternative systems stay operational. This is the architecture of the emerging financial landscape. Not a dollar collapse, but a dollar realm. A sphere of influence where dollar-denominated infrastructure dominates, surrounded by other spheres where alternative systems have taken root. This is less efficient than a unified global system. It's more stable for participants who don't trust the unified system's neutrality. And stability, in the end, matters more than efficiency when the efficient system can be turned off. The implications extend beyond geopolitics. When financial infrastructure fragments, capital flows fragment. When capital flows fragment, economic development patterns change. A nation excluded from dollar systems can't easily borrow in international markets. It can't attract Western investment through conventional channels. It must find alternative sources of capital, develop differently. China's Belt and Road loans to developing nations aren't charity. They're infrastructure for an alternative financial ecosystem. Nations that might have borrowed from the IMF or World Bank instead borrow from Chinese policy banks. They integrate into yuan-denominated systems. They become part of a different financial architecture. This isn't better or worse in moral terms. It's different in structural terms. And the difference is that power, which was centralized in Western institutions, is now distributing across multiple centers. This is what makes the current moment distinctive. For 70 years, global finance was effectively unipolar. The United States and its allies controlled the critical infrastructure. That infrastructure was treated as neutral, but its governance was Western. What we're witnessing is the end of that unipolarity, not through American collapse, but through the emergence of parallel poles. The final observation is about timescales. These processes move slowly. A central bank doesn't abandon dollar reserves overnight. A trade bloc doesn't replace SWIFT immediately. The infrastructure takes years to build. The network effects take time to develop. This creates illusion of stability. Dollar dominance looks secure in any given year. The changes are incremental, easily dismissed, but incremental changes compound. A 1% shift in reserve holdings per year seems trivial. Over a decade, it's 10%. Over 2 decades, the landscape is transformed. The weaponization of financial infrastructure began in earnest around 2012 with Iran. We're now in 2026, 14 years. We're in the middle phase. The infrastructure has been weaponized. The alternatives are being built. We haven't yet reached the point where alternatives are fully viable at scale. But we're moving toward it. And unlike traditional weapons, which can be disarmed, infrastructure weaponization is difficult to reverse. Once nations invest in parallel systems, those systems persist. They become embedded. They create constituencies and interests that support their continuation. This is the quiet architecture of the emerging order. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the slow, mechanical process of institutions adapting to changed incentives. When infrastructure is weaponized, infrastructure fragments. When infrastructure fragments, power diffuses. When power diffuses, the ability to use infrastructure as a weapon declines. This isn't prediction. It's observation of processes already underway. The only question is how far the process advances before equilibrium is reached, before the cost of fragmentation outweighs the cost of dependence. That equilibrium point hasn't arrived yet. We're still in the phase where fragmentation is accelerating, where each use of financial sanctions creates new incentive for alternative systems, where trust in neutral infrastructure continues to erode. The architects of this system believed they were deploying leverage without cost. What they actually deployed was a demonstration that the system is not neutral, that access is conditional, that dependence is vulnerability. And that demonstration is creating the very outcome it was designed to prevent. A world where American financial infrastructure is no longer indispensable, where power is distributed, where control is diffuse. This is the unintended consequence. Not immediate, not dramatic, just the slow erosion of the foundation on which the weapon was built. The dollar isn't collapsing. SWIFT isn't disappearing. Western financial institutions remain dominant. But dominance is eroding. The process is slow enough that it doesn't appear in crisis headlines, fast enough that, when we look back a decade from now, the landscape will have shifted. This is how structural change occurs. Not through sudden collapse, but through accumulation of small decisions. Each one rational, each one responding to incentives, collectively transforming the architecture of global finance. Watch the infrastructure, not the headlines. The infrastructure tells you where power is moving. And right now, it's moving toward fragmentation. This is silent economy.